To this day, the 15th century palace of the Ottoman sultans sits high upon a hill in Istanbul, Turkey. From inside these walls, they ruled the powerful Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. But the golden age of the Ottomans came under a sultan whose celebrated reign lasted an incredible 46 years. His name, Suleiman the Magnificent. Like Alexander the Great, Suleiman inherited his wealth and power from his father. In 1520, his empire included parts of Europe, Asia Minor, Syria, Upper Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Egypt. His powerful government was based on efficient administration, run less like a military stronghold and more like an organized bureaucracy.
He was the very first Ottoman ruler to make sure that power devolved not around the person of the Sultan, but had become somewhat impersonal through codes, through ritual, through ceremonial, through organized forms of behavior that did not depend on a singular person.
And in a way, that's beginning to show us what the future is going to be countries that are based around bureaucracies, around great civil administration. In that regard, Suleiman the Magnificent is a very modern person.
He controlled his empire from the huge Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a sprawling compound of endless rooms, mosques, and minarets, a hospital, and a school. A staff of almost 20,000 worked within the confines of its walls. Nearly 5,000 lived there on a daily basis.
The Topkapi Palace was probably the most magnificent building ever built, with the greatest amount of wealth ever housed in any one building in the world.
Walls of gold, silver, and thousands of ornate tiles sheltered the dazzling riches of the empire. Suleiman skillfully used all of it to project an image of his power and magnificence to all who visited.
The way it projects power and magnificence is not through grand architecture, but the costumes, the jewels, the very expensive tile works, all of those would constitute the most important material objects with which he would live lavishly and project magnificence to others.
The splendor of Suleiman's influence spilled over the palace walls and onto the battlefield. During the first 2 years of his reign, he led 2 great conquests that struck at the heart of Europe. In 1521, Suleiman invaded Hungary. He marched into Belgrade and secured the lands along the Danube River. A year later, he attacked the great fortress at Rhodes and took control of the Aegean Sea. His navy was the dominant force on the Mediterranean. It raided coastal towns in Italy and Spain and dealt a crushing blow to the European fleets. Suleiman's victories nearly doubled the size of his empire and shaped his image as the protector and ruler of Islam. He was called Suleiman the Lawgiver for his role in refining ancient codes of Islamic law, and revered as Suleiman the Magnificent for his influence over European politics and his generous patronage of the arts. Suleiman brought the Ottoman Empire to its creative peak. He sponsored art, culture, and architecture, and used his great wealth to bring the best artists and poets to Istanbul. "I know of no state which is happier than this one," wrote a Venetian ambassador. "It is furnished with all God's gifts. It controls war and peace. It is rich in gold, in people, in ships, and in obedience." Obedience was expected, and Suleiman controlled his country with whatever force was needed.
Suleiman the Magnificent, like other sultans, kept a group of deaf mutes who were trained to kill. And Suleiman used them repeatedly against his own officers and even against his own sons. In one case, he watched himself while the deaf-mute strangled his own son. He was a harsh man. He lived in a very harsh world, but he was able to rule this empire very effectively.
Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the world, died of an illness in 1566. He was 72 years old. The golden age of the Ottoman Empire ended when Suleiman died. The government became weaker, territories were lost, and suddenly global power shifted to the great nation-states of Europe. Across the Mediterranean Sea, a young boy inherited the Kingdom of France and went on to create an image of the world's most glorious king. His reign lasted for 72 years, the longest in European history. But his wealth and power were not as grand as they might have seemed.
By the time you get to Louis XIV, you're really in an era when you're talking about rule by public impression and celebrity, that he wasn't a great conqueror. He wasn't even a great administrator, but he knew how to dress. He appeared to be a glamorous person, and it was almost the beginning of the cult of celebrityhood, way back there in his time. There's nothing like the great conquest of Genghis Khan, nothing like the law-giving abilities of Solomon.
Louis was only 15 in 1654 when he was crowned sovereign of more than 19 million French subjects. The kings who ruled before him relied heavily on the advice of their ministers. But when Louis was only 23 years old, he bucked tradition and declared that he would now rule by himself. For 54 more years, he immersed himself so deeply in every aspect of his kingship that he was known to say, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. He was hailed by the people of Paris as Louis the Grand, known throughout Europe as the Sun King. It was a fitting symbol. As the sun gives life to all things, King Louis believed he gave life to his country.
He believed very much in this craft of being a king. He spent 6 to 8 hours behind the desk reading dispatches. He was a great believer in the majesty of kingship and did a great deal to design an image of himself as a great king.
He was probably somebody that most people today would have found rather rigid, very aloof, rather difficult. But of course, as far as Louis was concerned, these characteristics were part of the majesty of kingship, and he didn't regard being a ruler as somebody who went round being a chum.
Though he lived in palaces all his life, none was a better symbol of Louis XIV's grandeur than the 2,000-room Chateau of Versailles.
Versailles was a stage for the display of power. The whole organization of Versailles, the painted chambers with on the ceilings scenes of military glory associated with Louis XIV, the big room with all the mirrors. These were designed as stages for Louis's majesty in order to show his power before his subjects and before visitors.
Versailles was a great show of France's strength. But the power of the king's court was clearly illustrated by wealth of a different kind.
His wealth also had to be measured in very direct terms in the kind of military power he could put on the chessboard of Europe, if you will. France was probably the greatest military power.
Louis XIV took control of Dutch territory that today is part of Holland, attacked the Spanish Netherlands and captured part of Flanders and Luxembourg. And he seized Alsace-Lorraine from the Holy Roman Empire.
He could date the day upon which a city that was besieged would fall, and he would invite the ladies and gentlemen of the court to come out and watch the fall of the city. So even warfare for him was spectacle.
King Louis kept his country at war for almost his entire reign. And some of his most brutal battles were waged against his own people.
There is a passage in Madame de Sévigné's journal in which she comments on how many trees are lean to one side of the roads, and that was because, as she notes, so many peasants had been hung from those trees.
King Louis XIV died in 1715 at the age of 77. On his deathbed, he said, "I have loved war too much." Despite the bloodshed, he is remembered as the king of all kings, the quintessential example of the grand monarch.
Louis XIV was central in creating the modern nation state as a concept in Europe. The length of his reign, the cultural and political things he did, the consequences of his reign just mark him as one of the decisive figures in European and therefore world history.
But the accomplishments of King Louis XIV seem almost trivial compared to a tyrant to the east, a man who dictated the way his citizens dressed, shaved, and even socialized. Peter the Great of Russia is next. It took 36,000 men and 6,000 horses to complete the construction of Versailles. Today, the ambitious project would cost King Louis XIV over $1.5 billion to build.